Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Budget Advocacy in the Age of COVID-19. We're going to be getting started in just a few minutes, so please sit back and enjoy. We are asking folks to share where you're from, so if you can use the chat button and let us know where you're coming from. It'll be helpful for us to know and for other attendees as well. I think we've hopefully got a good chunk of the state represented. And please make sure that you're sending to all the attendees as well. So you can see we've got a little picture here on the slide. If you go to your chat window, you can choose who it should go to. Please choose all panelists and attendees so all of us can know who's in the room. Thanks so much. Let's see, and morning to folks who are just joining. We'll start in a couple minutes. Please, if you're able, share where you're coming from using the chat function. You can see the instructions here. We'll just get started in a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Okay, and one more thing to do before we get started. You should see a poll popping up on your screen asking about your top budgetary concern in the couple months ahead. We're hoping to share some good information on this webinar today, but would also like to learn from you all so that the publications and support that we provide is targeted to what's actually happening on the ground. So if you're able to respond to this, let us know what you're most interested in. That'll be really helpful for us. So please just take a minute to answer the poll. And for folks who haven't heard me do the spiel before, we're also asking everybody to share what city or part of California you're coming in from. And you can do that using the chat function. And please make sure that you're broadcasting to everybody, not just the panelists, which you can do by going to the chat function and clicking on the little button next to the to field. Thanks so much. We'll get started in just another couple minutes. Okay, we got a bunch of poll results already. Looks like we've got two that are well ahead of the rest of them. Misalignment between decision maker budget priorities and community needs, and meaningful engagement being the two top ones so far. So a lot about how decision makers and officials are actually hearing from communities and how their decisions are going to impact folks. Okay. Great, let's just take one more minute for folks to get into the chat where they're from and then settle down. I know you'll be joining us for our hour-and-a-half long webinar, so appreciate you taking the time. Okay, well, once again, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Russo. I'm the Director of Equity and Community Investments for Advanced Project California, and welcome. We appreciate so much you taking the time to spend with us this morning. We'd like to just take a minute to center ourselves as we open the webinar. We know that there is a lot happening in all of our lives, both professionally and personally, with our families, with the communities many of us live in and serve, and want to acknowledge that there are demands, stress, challenges that we're all holding. And so hopefully we can all be centered in this time that we share together. So I invite you all to take a deep breath before we begin and use that as a moment to reflect on our gratitude and appreciation that you all are joining us today, and hope that we've got something of value to share with you. So take a deep breath now. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide and get into it, please. Great. So once again, welcome. We're here as part of the work that Advancement Project California is doing to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for those of you who don't know us that well, Advancement Project California is a civil rights organization. We work statewide, been around about 20 years, and we work to end racial disparities in all aspects of California society. And we really focus on the big public systems that have so much of an impact on all of our lives. And many of us here represent our Equity and Community Investments program area, which is all about looking at the ways that public investments and public policy decisions impact what our communities look like, and really grappling with the ways that the legacies of disinvestment and criminalization have created disparities in communities of color, and looking at ways that additional advocacy, investment, and making public budgets work for communities can help move through that. So we just put out a report, Meeting Crisis with Courage, which hopefully many of y'all have seen. If not, it's available on our website, which you can see the URL there, which provides an overview of how we see that mission playing out in these next few months. We know that public budgets are always important, and public resources and how they're being spent are some of the key equity issues. And that's even more the case at times like this, when there's a public health crisis, meaning that we need more services, we need more supports from our public entities. And we also know that there's a deficit coming, and there are going to be resource crunches coming up. So our hope is to arm you all with some information, some resources, potentially even some connections with others of y'all in the work that you're doing, as we weather this moment and make sure that local budgets, cities, counties, and school districts are prioritizing equity in this moment and their response. We can move ahead to the next slide, please. Just a couple logistics and working agreements. I know we're all a little zoomed out and have seen a lot of this, but just to ask us all, ourselves included, to stay present and mindful of the space that we're sharing with y'all. We do have everybody with your videos off and with mute on, because we do have over 200 participants at this point. So hopefully that makes it a little more low-key to be on the webinar with us. The webinar will be recorded, so if you have colleagues who are interested but weren't able to join, you will be able to share this with them. We'll be sending that out to everybody who registered, so keep an eye out after the webinar concludes. And then in terms of engagement, we'll be using the chat and QA features primarily to make sure that we're hearing from y'all, as well as the poll feature, which we've already seen. At certain points through the presentation, we'll be stopping to ask for questions and answers. So the best way to do that would be to enter things into the Q&A feature, which you should see in the bottom of the screen. So please just click on that, and we'll be able to take at least hopefully some of your questions and answer them as we go through. Next slide, please. And just to introduce who we are, as mentioned, I'm Mike Russo. I'm the director of our Equity and Community Investments program at Advancement Project California. I'm joined by my colleagues on the ECI team, Asad Beg, Jackie Guerrero, Anisha Hirgarani, and Daniel Worley. And Sandra Celedon from Fresno Building Healthy Communities, the president and CEO there, is also joining us. She's a really impactful, really amazing advocate doing great work in Fresno City, and she'll be sharing some of her perspectives on what long-term power building and fighting for equity look like in Fresno over the past few years, and what that means at this moment right now. Next slide, please. And just an agenda to let you know where we are headed. So we'll be going through 4 major subjects this morning. First, we'll talk a bit about how we got to this point. So some basics on the history that's led us to this point, and how past policy decisions, both statewide and some local, have shaped what local budgets look like, and create some vulnerabilities that mean that this crisis is a time when there are a lot of risks, especially for low-income communities and communities of color. Second, we'll do a deeper dive into what budgeting might look like in the COVID-19 era. Obviously, this is a rapidly moving situation. A lot is changing, but we're trying to pull together good information on what to expect from the federal and state legislation that is doing some work to support local budgeting, some updates on what the timeline and what advocacy opportunities might start to look like around local budgets, as well as digging into some issues around services, programs, revenues, and how that might play out across the state. Third, we'll start pivoting into some strategies and key things that advocates and policymakers should be doing to meet this moment. So talking about what power building for communities looks like at this moment, and how to make sure that there is accountability and is a connection between what communities need and are asking for right now and the decisions that public officials are making, which from the results of the poll seems like that's something that's top of mind for many of y'all. And then we'll wrap up by talking through how to make sure that equity is really essential to both the response and the eventual recovery from COVID-19. We have seen what happens, as in the Great Recession in many places, when equity is not centered, and it leads to compounding disparities and more and more challenges even many years after the crisis has passed. And we know that this pandemic is hitting communities of color much harder than other communities. And so it's really critical to make sure that equity is at the forefront of folks' understanding of and response to this crisis, including in local budgets. So that's what we're going to share with you all this morning. Once again, welcome and thanks for taking the time to spend the morning with us. And at that, let me hand it over to Daniel to start talking through how we got to this point and some of the budget history behind local budgets in California.
Great, thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. As Mike said, I'm going to take you through a bit of the budget history just to give you a sense of where we're going. I think one of the things that's important to remember is it's in order to design the most effective advocacy strategies for today and what's to come, it's really important to understand the budget context for your particular community, both its possibilities and its constraints. And knowing how we got here is really vital to that understanding. For our purposes, this largely starts with the impact of 1978's Proposition 13. So if you could go to the next slide. In capping property taxes for both residential and commercial properties, the proposition led to severely reduced revenue bases for communities, and that had many cascading impacts. Many of you are familiar with those, but we'll just run through some of them to explain why it impacts what we're looking at today. Obviously, in the wake of Prop 13, localities were left with fewer tools to raise revenues and became overly reliant on sources that were highly volatile. And by that, I mean the sorts of revenues that they were raising went up and down much more quickly than some other revenue sources. So for instance, over the course of a generation, fees and fines became a major revenue source for cities and counties as they were trying to fill some of the gap left by those big declines left by the property taxes that were shrinking in the wake of Prop 13. Likewise, many cities raised sales taxes over the last generation or two as a way also to try to raise revenue to fill in those gaps. But as you can note, sales taxes and fees and fines are regressive revenues. So these are revenues that disproportionately impact low-income community members. This response also, in terms of trying to fill those gaps, made California communities uniquely vulnerable to a fiscal crisis such as this one, because all of those funding sources are prone to rapid shrinkage in an economic recession. So one like this, in which sales taxes rapidly evaporated and business fees basically went with it, and other fees and fines shrank proportionately, you start to see like communities in California that are very reliant upon these sources all of a sudden are in a almost immediate revenue shortage. What we also saw in the wake of Prop 13 is that federal and state support did fill some of those gaps as well. But each of those sources come with their own built-in limitations. So for instance, while California state has stepped in some of these regards, it also relies heavily on income taxes, another revenue source that's prone to wild revenue swings in a recession. It also left local budgets very dependent on distant lawmakers' decision-making. So accountability became more of an issue. And this is critical to keep in mind as we start talking about what are things that are being discussed right now at the state and federal level to impact local communities, that in many ways, while the local budgets are getting important assistance, they also have less of a say in how that some of those are shaped. And importantly, what comes out of this is all of those supports, all of those attempts to raise revenue still didn't fill many of the gaps that were left by Prop 13, relatively speaking. So smaller revenues often led to shrinking investments in public services and schools, with proportionally more devoted to things like law enforcement. So this gradually skewed resources away from investments that we might see as uplifting communities, things like health, education, recreation, and more towards punitive ones such as law enforcement and jails. And in sum, what all of these trends in the wake of Proposition 13 led to, historic disinvestment, regressive revenue raising, and less local accountability, has fed into growing racial inequities here in California in all communities. So while each community's budget is unique and has its own unique sort of parameters, we see in almost every community across the state that these actions have led to growing inequities. And this in turn has also led to greater vulnerabilities and unequal impacts that this crisis is elevating. So if you wouldn't mind the next slide, please. So this is just one example of how looking at the economic impact of Proposition 13 has played out. So as we can see from this historic example, while once above the national average, since the passage of Prop 13, California's per pupil spending has lagged not only behind the nation, but fallen well behind states that would be comparable, such as New York. So again, this just illustrates one aspect of Proposition 13's historical impact that continues to play out today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So keeping in mind this context, one of the things that we recommend is that advocates should move quickly to analyze their local budgets to begin assessing the risk. This information is important to allow you to identify where departments and services that you're trying to protect are most vulnerable and develop some realistic targeted budget asks. One thing that we stress is that longer time frame, which we say here is 12 years, is important to go back before the Great Recession to help identify how your locality prioritized recovery spending in its aftermath, both in terms of where areas were cut most severely and how the recovery efforts lagged. And this is really crucial for most of the things that we are all concerned with, is that in many cases, as I said, the areas in which cuts happened most severely and were slowest to recover were in the things that we would say are uplifting positive investments. And another thing to keep in mind is while budgets and historical comparisons can be overwhelming at times in their complexity, that's why we really recommend that you zero in on some key departments and or service areas, one, to help narrow the scope, but also to paint a more clear picture when you're putting this data into a budget analysis or making an ask or talking to a lawmaker, is that a more targeted sort of an assessment is much more effective than sort of all data under the sun. And so one thing that we recommend is a good place to start is by tracking staffing levels for important areas that you're interested in, as well as assessing how local revenues, which have the greatest sort of flexibility in terms of how they can be spent, how those local revenues were spent over time, because that gives helpful shortcuts in terms of getting at the levels of services that have been provided. And I will also say, in summation of that, is our equity and community investments team, as Mike shared, we have teamed with partners over the years to build capacity in this area of budget analysis over the years. And as this work is, of course, more vital than ever, we're happy to lend our support where possible. So I just want to give you one example of how we have teamed up. If we could go to the next slide. Where we've teamed up with advocates in Fresno City, and you'll hear more about some of this work to come. But just to give you one example, and again, you don't need to know necessarily all the details of this chart, but the important issue is that it does tell a story. And so what we see here is essentially, starting in 2006, we basically pegged where local revenues and spending tracked over time. And in this case, we illustrated how that change over time shows that the revenue the city was bringing in obviously took a pretty big dip during the recession and started to gradually increase upward. And what you see is that the spending from that one line that's next to it, that is the line that goes towards policing. And that line basically tracks along with where the revenues are. As you can see, it takes a minor dip during the recession and starts tracking back up fairly quickly and stays consistent, and in some cases outpacing even where the general revenues are coming in. But if you look at the line that's below it, you'll see that the spending on parks and other recreation sources goes way down during the recession and is slow to recover in terms of the years that are spent in that deficit mode, and also the recovery pace is somewhat slower. And so again, this starts to tell a story of how localities have prioritized their spending during a recession and afterward. One thing I do want to flag, and this will come up later as well, is that you do see at the very tail end of that chart that park spending does start to see an increase. And again, this shows the power of advocacy, is that the Fresno advocates really made a push in using some of this data to tell that story, is that parks and recreation, other sort of asset-based spending has tailed behind policing, and that this is something that needs to be addressed by the city council. And with that, I will turn it over to, we have a brief question and answer session. So any questions you might have, once again, at the bottom of your screen, you have the possible tab there to signal any questions you might have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So as Daniel said, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A window. We'll try to get to some, although there will be opportunities throughout the rest of the webinar as well. It looks like we've got one question already. Do we have a tool to suggest for ordinary residents to use now to do a long-term budget analysis? So I can take first crack on that, and then Daniel and others, if you'd like to jump in, please do so. I will say it is challenging, you know, as we'll start getting into when we talk through what budget processes look like. They're challenging, somewhat obscure processes and documents in the best of circumstances, and these are certainly not the best of circumstances. So that's why, frankly, a lot of the work that we try to do is to open up budgets and, you know, make it a little easier to, you know, crunch the data and understand what's going on there. I would say, you know, probably the easiest thing to do is to first look at what your city, county, or school district puts up on their website. Most of them do have publicly available budgets going back many years at this point. And you know, often by just looking at what's in the cover memo, the letter that's written from a city manager or a county CEO, that flags often some of the key issues and considerations. Another easy thing to do is to look at staffing levels for important departments. Often funding sources and funding amounts can fluctuate quite a lot, but often staffing levels are reflective of what's actually happening and what level of services are really being delivered. And it's a little easier to just understand what that translates into and track over time. So that can be an easier way to start with the analysis. And then finally, often looking at general fund dollars and not looking as much into the various special funds and dedicated revenue streams that localities get, also can give a better sense of where, you know, decision makers are allocating the money that they have flexibility over, because usually the general fund is where the city council or the board of supervisors have the flexibility and the ability to make decisions about different priorities, again, versus various special funds and grants, which can be more complex, and often, you know, there's not as much accountability as Daniel shared. But again, Daniel or others, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to share to respond to that question.
I think that's pretty comprehensive. I will say in some of larger localities, you have the advantage of some of your lawmakers have started putting together sort of provisional plans in terms of what the deficits might look like and how they might start to address it. But as Mike said, obviously all of this is moving quite quickly. So even those early assessments that were made, you know, in April might look very different now and could look very different even a month from now. So those are good guideposts, but I think Mike's advice is very apt for how to begin the process.
Great, we've got a couple more questions. We've got one about the Schools and Communities First ballot initiative and what successful examples of budget advocacy have looked like. I think we'll hopefully be able to address that in some of the later portions of the webinar. So I think we'll revisit that one later on. But then we also have a question asking about revenue sources for cities, asking whether they're only property taxes and sales taxes or if there are any others. So Daniel, do you want to take that one?
Sure. For most localities, it's a mix of revenue sources, and as I said, every city has a slightly different sort of revenue mix. But one of the things and why we raised Proposition 13 is it did fundamentally shift that revenue mix for most localities in California away from a pretty heavy dependence upon local property taxes to one that's more reliant on things like sales taxes and to some extent fees and fines. And so while there is a host of things coming in, it's not only fees and fines and property taxes and sales taxes. You'll see a lot of communities have become heavily reliant on sales taxes, much more so than you might even see in other parts of the country. But that also makes California communities extremely vulnerable in a crisis like this, where sales taxes have plummeted. So that's one of the vulnerabilities, is that whereas a property tax is a little bit slower in terms of the revenues to decline, something like a sales tax declines almost immediately. So that's one of the things. While there's a mixture of sources coming in and most of them will be impacted by a recession, something like a sales tax goes down very quickly. And in this case, goes down very precipitously, which also makes it difficult to plan for when the recovery will be or what the revenues might be in the future.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Okay, I think we need to move on. I see there are a few more questions, so we'll try to respond to some of those later on. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll also try to respond to them in the wrap-up email that we send around. So apologies for not getting to everybody, and apologies too. I know there has been some background noise, which we'll try to manage, but please bear with us. Okay, with that, Assad, do you want to take us into the next section?
Sure. Hi, folks. My name is Assad Beg. Thank you again for joining us. In the next section, we'll talk about budgeting in the COVID era. There's a lot to unpack here. Some of the general themes we'll cover will include the intersection of federal, state, and local dollars. We'll look into this idea of equitable recovery and what that could look like. And then we will close by talking about strategies to ensure that funds actually match community needs. And then we'll go to the next slide. So the first piece to really unpack is the Federal CARES Act. There's obviously a lot of information in there. For the purposes of this presentation, we really tried to keep a general overview of what resources look like for local government. Daniel mentioned in the previous section before that there have been some dire reports of revenue that's going to be cut off because of the COVID crisis. And the main goal of this, of the Federal CARES Act, is to really look into how can we actually strategize into the future to close those revenue gaps. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different funding sources. The first one and largest one is the direct transfers into state and local treasuries. On the left side, you'll find that it's a statewide amount, includes state allocations, local allocations. And on the right side, we've broken out what that number looks like for cities, counties, and school districts. The largest allocation is direct transfers to state and local treasuries. It's about $15.3 billion. The state allocation is $9.5 billion. Cities and counties account for about $5.8 billion. There are a few caveats though. It covers expenditures through December 2020, meaning that jurisdictions will have to budget out how they'll spend the dollars halfway through the fiscal year. So it'll be tough to really plan for the last 6 months of fiscal year 2021 if there are expenditures that are going to be realized. The second caveat with the direct transfers is that it only covers costs related to COVID-19 only, meaning the revenue coming in can't be used to backfill a decline in sales taxes. It can only be used for new expenses related to COVID. This does limit the flexibility on how dollars can actually go out the door and limit which communities can reach those dollars. So there are some limitations to that. And the last piece to that, and I think the most well-known one, is that jurisdictions under 500,000 people were left out of this spending plan. So Los Angeles with 4 million people obviously got a major chunk of money, but its neighboring community, Long Beach, because it's under 500,000 people, did not receive funding. The second major funding stream from the CARES Act is the Federal Transit Agency. It's about $3.7 billion. Almost all of it will be going to local transportation agencies. The main goal with this funding stream is to reimburse agencies for lost revenue. Ideally, they would be able to maintain and expand services and really focus in on employee protective equipment. And just for scale, the largest transfers will be for the Los Angeles Long Beach area, which is about 1.2 billion of the 3.7 billion allocated. And right now, a lot of local agencies and decision makers are trying to parcel out how those dollars will go out the door. In terms of K through 12 education, total allocation statewide is about $2 billion. And there's a couple of different ways that those dollars go out the door. The first one is state and local allocation via the Title I formula. In terms of local districts, they have about $1.5 billion that should be coming to them through the state using the Title I formula. So there is some equity principles built in there. There is a separate state allocation using the formula as well. And lastly, there is an emergency fund for the governor to use for any educational purpose, which is about $360 million. This is a little more flexible. It can be used to resource programs such as distance learning, health programs, credit recovery. The issue is leaning into LCFF. We've had a lot of folks that have connected with us and asked us how will LCFF be implemented. That will be up to local districts to decide. So once their allocation of the $1.5 billion comes into their pipeline, decisions on equity, decisions on which school districts or which specific schools, which programs will be up to local policymakers. And the last major source of funding comes from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. There's been a proliferation of community development block grants and emergency solutions grants for cities and counties. Emergency solution grants are almost exclusively for housing and homeless programs, and jurisdictions rely on them heavily to not just provide direct housing support, but to resource their services as well. And community development block grants have also been proliferated. They mainly cover a lot of housing infrastructure, but they're having provisions to include certain public health expenditures as part of the CARES Act. And then we'll go over to the next slide, which will connect this information to state and local perspectives. At the state level, right now, California has budgeted about $7 billion as part of its response to COVID-19. 75% of that is projected to be reimbursed by federal resources, and the previous slide before provided an outline of what California should expect to collect. But there will be some changes because the revenue picture looks different every day. The May revision will likely include additional public health expenditures and a first wave of cuts. Because there's revenue uncertainty with income taxes, there will be a placeholder budget adopted in June. And what we mean by that is there will probably be a budget in June. There'll be estimates in there, but those estimates will hold the risk of changing as we get more information on revenue deficits. Once the revenue picture clears, a supplemental process after June is expected to take place probably in fall and maybe even into winter. Now, there is a cascading effect to local governments as well. The erosion of flexible resources, like Daniel mentioned, such as sales, hotel, business taxes, has declined for many localities. There is some flexibility with property taxes, which are expected to have a slower drop-off in ordinary recessions. But right now, a lot of local jurisdictions are really hemorrhaging sales, hotel, and business taxes, which make up a large portion of general fund revenues. School districts rely heavily on the state. So like I mentioned the process before, whatever the state decides whatever the state's fiscal outlook will be, school districts will rely heavily on that to get an estimate for their fiscal year 2021 cycle. But there's also the issue of increasing costs. And so even if there is some consistency, even with the federal support, the rate of increase for distance learning, credit recovery is likely to exceed revenue coming in. And like the state, jurisdictions are likely to have placeholder budgets in the May-June cycle, probably adopt a final budget in June, and then come back with a supplemental process in summer and fall. We'll go on to the next slide. So a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of different revenue streams. There's a lot of contingencies between federal, state, and local actors. The main recommendation that we want to focus on and that we outline in our report was to match funds to community needs. Right now, there are plans to spend down dollars, but the main goal is to be careful, is to really focus in on the highest need communities and to really identify that who are the vulnerable communities, what are their services they need, because until everyone is safe, proper budgeting and proper risk management will be tough to accomplish. Next is the federal and state funding piece. Again, we really want to emphasize the definition of essential services, what that means in communities. I think we all understand that folks really do need more health programming, access to housing services, and we know, as we learned from the lesson of Fresno, that a lot of times law enforcement does end up becoming a major investment goal for communities. And so trying to ensure that federal and state resources complement each other and provide real community programmings. The last recommendation is to really adhere to equity principles. As you mentioned, Title I grants, CDBG grants, special purpose funds, these funds are all tied to specific spending plans, meaning that a jurisdiction can't just spend it on anything they want, but there are some equity principles built in. We will see an increase of transfers from these funds to close budget gaps in the next couple of months. And so we really would like advocates and policymakers to work together to figure out, can we balance equity and really identify the highest need communities using these special fund dollars. That should wrap it up for this section, and then I'll pass it over to Mike if you have any Q&As.
Great, thanks, Asad. Once again, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A tool. And I see we've already got a couple. Maybe we can start with this one from Havana. What funding resources do counties and cities have if they do not exceed 500,000 people? Asad, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Right now, at the federal level, there are plans to have a fourth round of a stimulus package, and so there are conversations to include communities under 500,000 people. At the state level, the state's getting a large allocation of federal funding. The state could use some of the funds that it's receiving to support local governments to close gaps. And the last one, it would be to tap into their own reserves and special funds. Those are the three sort of layers. Obviously, the timing looks different. Some are more flexible than others, but it is going to be layered in the next couple of months on how smaller communities are going to close those gaps.
Great, thanks. Let's see, here's one more question. What are the guidelines on what COVID-19 related can include? And I think that means, what can the federal emergency funds be used for? Since you had mentioned that it must be something related to COVID-19, could you talk through in a little more detail what that actually would look like?
Sure. It's a very broad definition. We've definitely done some research. There is a public health focus on COVID-related costs. I don't have specifics that might look different for cities and counties, but what we can do is find examples of jurisdictions and what they're planning, and then get back to folks on what that looks like for every community.
Great, thanks. And let's see, maybe one more. So Mariana asks if there's a tool or a way to track how local governments, including the city and county of LA, are going to be utilizing the CARES Act funding.
Sure. So we're now sort of in early May. Everyone is closing out their fiscal year and starting the new one. And probably proposed budgets are being released in the next couple of weeks. Those budgets and the budgeting process should have a plan for how to spend federal resources. And so I think tracking specific budget committees council hearings coming up in the next couple of weeks. There will be plans in there. I also recommend looking into council files or different county board files, because the reports are uploaded from different CEO's office, the city manager's office, on what the revenues are, what the deficits could be. And so it should be available as part of the regular budget process in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit. So, I mean, the basic answer is that there's not like a single uniform set of reporting that localities are currently slated to use that'll show up in real time. So that's a really important advocacy point. So, you know, if you do have relationships with city or county officials, or you have the ability to make some noise and ask some questions, I think that would be a really key one to elevate early to make sure that they commit to, you know, reporting exactly how much money they're getting and what they're going to be doing with it. Because as Assad said, there's a lot of different things that could wind up being COVID related, and, you know, the vision of the world in which that money primarily goes to, you know, supporting folks who have increased housing instability because of the, you know, the pandemic, and going to PPE for essential workers and folks in you know, the jobs that put them on the front lines. That's a different world than the one where it just goes to backfill, you know, police overtime from folks who are more likely to bang out sick. So very high stakes, and making sure that there's transparency is going to be, I think, really important. Let's see, I know there are still a few more questions. Again, we'll try to answer some of these in the wrap up that we send around, or later on in the presentation, but I think we will move on from here. So next slide, please. We're about at the midpoint, and we know 90 minutes can be a little long time, so we wanted to just take a quick break. So we'll take 3 minutes to take 3 deep breaths, and if folks need to get some water or you know, take care of anything else, we will just take 3 minutes. So we'll be back at 10:47. Thank you so much. We'll be coming back in about 1 more minute. Thanks, everybody. Okay, hopefully folks were able to refresh and recenter themselves, but let's move on to the next section. Anisha, I think you are up.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. So I think what folks are really interested in hearing is about how to really push back against some of the concerns we're seeing around public participation and really flex our community power to ensure voices are heard in this critical time. So as I mentioned, the lack of transparency and public accountability during this time is very real, especially in this critical time of need. In cases across the state, we've seen local governments cancel meetings last minute, and even when they are in session, the public must jump through hoops to make their voices heard. And as many of you have experienced, the move to virtual meetings has often resulted in limited public comment opportunities, little to no language access options, and inaccessible public leaders. What this means is that our most vulnerable community members are being effectively shut out of the conversation. In many cases, council or board hearings don't prioritize community needs on the agenda, or worse, are proceeding without the urgency that this current moment requires. And even when pandemic response and recovery decisions do occur, they are usually opaque, top-down, and lack community input. There are real fears that the federal and state stimulus funds will go towards bolstering the existing agenda of decision makers and not go towards supporting the serious and immediate needs of communities of color. So what can we do to push for true public participation and hold elected officials accountable? In crises, we know that people with power and influence tend to consolidate their power. So it's critical to mobilize against this. This is hard, long-term work, and organizations like the Fresno Building Healthy Communities have spent a decade organizing residents to flex their power and win equitable funding for Black and Brown Fresno residents. So let me turn it over to Sandra now to share some of the immediate public participation challenges she's seeing in the city of Fresno and some of the rapid response strategies her organization and coalition partners are using to build community power and interrupt business as usual.
Thanks, Anisha. Hi, everyone. Sandra Celedon here in Fresno. And I think part of what I really want to share with you all today is how important it is to identify long-term goals. And so at Fresno Building Healthy Communities, we started as a coalition in 2010 and really brought together organizations, existing organizations that have been in our community for decades, along with community members themselves who traditionally have been excluded from decision-making spaces. And so one of the things that we understood in 2010 was the importance of partnering directly with community residents and enabling residents to be able to share their own experiences and the expertise that they hold. And so many of the issues that I think we're hearing today in COVID-19 are not necessarily new to our communities. They're existing inequities that are built into the systems that drive our society. And so in reality, what we're seeing is an exacerbation of the inequities that folks have already been struggling with. And so in 2010, as we laid out to organize and really start to build people power, one of the things that we started to do is really identify the areas and issues that we wanted to focus on. And so many of those are the same that we're discussing today around housing, and not just ensuring healthy housing through adequate code enforcement and inspection programming, but also investment from our city officials and our county officials around developing affordable housing to enable individuals to be housed. We do have a huge concentration of individuals experiencing homelessness. We also identified parks as a huge motivator in our community to see investment shifted as we know in many communities, the divide is often split between either east or west or north or south or some other type of delineation. In Fresno, it's north and south. So we know that now, we know that North residents enjoy a little bit close to 5 acres of park space for every 1,000 residents, compared to a little under an acre for every 1,000 residents in South Fresno, which tends to be predominantly the home of folks that identify as people of color and working class folks. And so we identified parks as another issue. And so as we organized around how to build power in how to just build relationships in our community, we really started to take stock of what we wanted, but also recognize that we weren't necessarily ready to engage. And so in 2013, we set about really spending time for training both our partner staff and community members themselves. And so we started by doing basic things like understanding what is SMART goal setting and how to do that, power mapping, and really starting to understand who holds power in our community. We tend to think that it's decision and elected decision makers that hold power in our community. And what we uncovered through our power mapping training and exercises is that, in fact, most times it's the influencers of those elected politicians that actually hold power. It's developers, it's agriculture, it's oil in the Central Valley that really holds power. And so we really needed to be more strategic about how we were applying pressure. And so that really led to budget discussions. And so after we went through the SMART goal setting kind of training and exercise and power mapping and really embedded that in our everyday work, we partnered with the Advancement Project to bring budget training so that we could really understand how to talk about the issues that we all knew, right? We didn't need data to tell us that our parks were dilapidated. Community members told us themselves. In fact, I remember very vividly, it was a 13-year-old young woman who we were partnering with who literally just said to us, "Why aren't we talking about parks?" And we said, "Well, what about parks?" And very eloquently, she said, "Well, they suck." And she was right. Our parks do suck, right? We know now that 80% of our parks are in complete disarray. And what really helped, again, was that training that we conducted in terms of getting prepared to be able to tell the story in a way that validated the experiences of folks on the ground that were telling us and had been sharing this experience with decision makers, and being able then to have a 10-year analysis of how we got here and being able to explain that to politicians and others that really motivated folks to continue this discussion. And so what happened in Fresno is we ended up changing the narrative about what's important, right? When we first started in 2013 and we started talking about housing and we started talking about parks, decision makers said to us, nobody cares. That's not the important, because that wasn't on their agenda. But we took it upon ourselves to elevate this issue and really made it an issue in Fresno to the point where they had to respond. And we built enough credibility through the training and expertise that we developed that folks had to respond to what we were highlighting and what community was voicing. And so that goes in line with today, right, in COVID-19, as we're starting to see a retraction of public meetings and breaking down, right, public participation opportunities, because that is also a tactic, right? It doesn't just happen in COVID-19, it was happening prior, right, when there were issues on the agenda that were contentious. We saw public speaking time cut down, right? And so part of the training and preparation that we conduct with our partners and community is really getting to how do we share our story in less than 2 minutes, right? What's our elevator pitch? How do we drive at the point that we're trying to make? But also, how do we get coverage of our issues before we even walk into that meeting or into that space, so that our agenda is already known in advance? And so I think with COVID-19, what we're seeing is we're having to shift our organizing strategy, right? Traditionally, organizing is absolutely reliant on relationships, right? And seeing each other frequently and staying connected. And so COVID-19 has really shifted the way that we stay connected with folks folks. And so what we're seeing with our partner organizations and community groups is that we've shifted to all continuing to host our monthly resident meetings through Zoom or through Facebook Live, right? Or using other channels like WhatsApp to stay in communication and continue to provide information that is readily available, that is necessary, plan actions, and also plan trainings. And so as we continue in our work, right, we conduct on an annual basis our budget training, which serves as an opportunity to onboard new folks that haven't participated in our budget advocacy in the past, and provides a little bit of an on-ramp to what we have done for the last 6 years now, and then also helps to start thinking about what are the goals that we want to advance this budget cycle. And so identifying those targets is really important, because then we create our plan about who's doing what. And this is where our collaboration really comes into play, and partnering with organizations and community members themselves, and thinking about who's taking on what part of the work, and continuing that discussion. And so I think with COVID-19, one of the things that really comes to light for me, which is applicable throughout the year, is this concept of accountability, and really starting to understand what are the parameters for any funding that is awarded for the local jurisdictions, whether that's the county or the city, right? Identifying which organization or staff member or community member will be the watchdog to alert the rest of the coalition on any changes that are relevant to those dollars that we're tracking. And then there's other groups or people that are in charge of making sure that we're translating, right, and breaking down concepts so that folks are able to understand what's being discussed, and then capturing feedback in different ways. So many of the times, right, meetings happen during times where community members are not available or are able to attend. So there is other ways that you can capture messaging, through social media, through postcards that we submit, or other ways to demonstrate that folks are supportive of the goal that you're advancing. And so I see many of those tactics that we've utilized in the past being applicable to COVID-19 response, right? And it's really also about starting to build your chops. So if you haven't done budget advocacy in the past, I think it's really important to identify a goal that is realistic within a short time period, and then be able to also celebrate that, right? We tend every year, we take some time in December to celebrate in community our achievements for the year, whether they're big or small, and really recognizing the small incremental steps that we've taken over the years. So, earlier we saw the funding for parks in Fresno. And since 2015, right, so for the last 5 years, we've been able to increase funding that's allocated for parks by 3%. Now, 3% doesn't seem like a huge step forward, but when we measure it in dollars, it actually is. And then, of course, the other piece is that the biggest win there is we changed the narrative on parks. Parks are considered now an essential service in our community, right? Just along with policing. And so that's the other win, that while we may not be at the stage we want to be yet, right, we have created a framework and a foundation that enables us to then continue to build on that momentum. So I would share that there's 3 important steps that I would highlight in any work that you're doing, whether it's around COVID-19 response or long-term budget advocacy, and that's the importance of collaboration and really identifying who are the advocates that will serve as connectors to other communities and other organizations, right? And identifying key roles for folks. Persistence, right? And much of advocacy is about wearing the system down, right? And so being persistent in your goal and in your endeavors. And then a commitment to the cause, right? Like, this work is really hard. It's taxing, it's tiring, it's emotionally draining. And so there does have to be a commitment to see this in the long haul. all of our campaigns where we've achieved the most success have been, from 5 to 8 years and ongoing. So it's certainly not, these are not short-term campaigns. And so it's really important to identify a commitment for the long haul, but also identify annual goals that you will measure some progress as you're moving forward. And then I will close that I think in the COVID-19 world, what we're shifting to is social safekeeping, right? Is how do we protect and defend what's currently in the budget for our communities, but also all of the wins that we've achieved over the last 10 years to make sure that we're not going even further back. And so the strategy may change a little bit in terms of making sure that you're defending your victories, but also leaving in some flexibility for any things that you may need to tweak or change. And so that would be, those would be my suggestions in the how to prepare and how to start thinking about your advocacy. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Anisha for some additional follow-up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was amazing. And just the spectrum of different things that you all have been working on and your advice and guidance to folks is really, really appreciated. So I just wanted to take another minute or two just to underscore some of the things that Sandra already mentioned, but that are also included as recommendations in our policy brief. So again, just for advocates, it's really important to build a diverse coalition with labor, community-based organizations, and other partners to avoid being pitted against each other when it comes time for budget allocations, because that's often what ended up happening in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So this includes developing inclusive community platforms, sharing intelligence, and standing up for each other publicly and privately. Again, it's also important to survey your community to assess needs and identify solutions. These stories and experiences become more vital than ever to underscore the urgency of community demands to elected officials who may be disconnected and are not hearing from residents in high-need communities. On the policymaker side, there are so many things we should be demanding to raise the bar for true public participation. This includes opening up the budget development process even more than in previous years through the use of tele or virtual town halls. I love the use of Facebook Live, WhatsApp, just trying to use whatever tools are out there that people are already using. Putting out a calendar with clear instructions for public engagement and sticking to it, publishing all relevant documents, providing translation and interpretation during meetings, and considering the fact that the digital divide is real, so that you're able to create new ways for multimodal approaches to public comments. So community members can review and weigh in, and committing to full transparency on how the stimulus funds are being used. And finally, just to wrap up this section, localities are already putting together recovery task forces, but very few to none of them have invited community-based organizations or residents. We really need to have community expertise as well as academics, data partners, and others at the table to determine what the critical needs are, where the most impacted communities are located, and how to equitably distribute resources based on need. So that wraps up my section, and I'll kick it back to Mike.
Great, thanks Anisha, and thanks Sandra. Just, I think, have time for one question here. Apologies, wanted to make sure we're staying on track, but there is one that I think, Sandra, maybe you could respond to. So Ray asked some questions about, just really how you do create this kind of accountability, and flags a couple of the challenges. So first, often there's only 72 hours of notice of when decision-making might be coming down the pike, and new budget documents and other things like that, which leaves not much time for response. And then also flagging some of the political constraints that many nonprofits might have relationships, including business, donations, and otherwise. I'm sure, as well as political relationships that sometimes can make it challenging to engage in conflict and really standing up in a way that draws attention. So I'm sure I know some of that stuff has been playing out in Fresno. You've got some experience there, so I don't know if you could share one or two thoughts about how you've been able to navigate some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think this is where I would really go back to before engaging in any of the work, you really want to take some time to build your coalition, right? And so part of building the coalition really is about asking yourself a couple of things that I think are really important is one, are you willing, are you ready and willing to engage in the advocacy that you're discussing, right? There does have to be a collective commitment to change. And so that collective commitment then comes with agreements, and that'll depend on your coalition. So part of, for us, before we even engaged, outwardly, we really spent, the first 3 years having internal conversations about what are the values that are driving our coalition, and how will we hold each other accountable, because we had already gone through some experiences of divide and conquer, right? And turning some of our partners against each other or attempting to. And so really identifying that at the forefront, thinking about also what are the assets that you already have within your coalition, and what are some of the obstacles that you anticipate facing, so that you can start to think through how would we respond if, our funding gets cut because we have a contract through the school district or through the city or through, whatever mechanism, and really being honest about that, right? And then providing an opportunity for coalition members to offboard if they don't feel comfortable with the approach that the coalition is taking. And then identifying what are opportunities for breakthroughs. So this is where the power mapping really comes into play, right? Because you're looking at who are the decision makers, who are the folks that have leverage in your community, and then being really clear about what is it that you want, and how will you who will give you what you want, and how will you go about it. Because even though notices are published 72 hours in advance, the reality is that those decisions are discussed a lot way in advance, right? And knowing who are the power brokers in your community, you also start to understand their agenda, right? And what are the agendas at play here. And then what's your offense, right? I think most nonprofits traditionally are used to playing defense, right? And fighting back against oppression. And that's, very much definitely our role, but we also need to start thinking about what is our offense, and how do we prepare in order to have that offense. And then maximizing pressure points and identifying tactics. So I think, I can't stress enough how important it is to spend, the time that is necessary in order to really at least have those initial steps outlined and some initial ideas, and if not fully thought out, have some parameters on how you will make those decisions. And then how will you measure, once you win? And so I think that this is where, as you're planning these actions, you're also identifying whether you have an inside or outside game, right? I mean, I'll be, very upfront that when Fresno Building Healthy Communities, when we started back in 2010 as a formal coalition, we didn't have much of an inside game, right? Most decision makers didn't necessarily have any respect for us, or thought that we were worthwhile engaging. And so as we flexed our organizing muscle, where we could pack City Hall with 300 people, where our residents absolutely could break the budget up and down, and really actually provide education to decision makers, our relationship started to focus. But really what was the most powerful was our organizing work, right? In getting young people engaged and engaging adult residents around the issues that they already cared about, and just providing the technique and the skills in order to be able to help them be heard. Really helped elevate the power. And then I think that then showed up in 2018 when we were able to leverage our coalition to gather 35,000 signatures to put Measure P, which is our park sales tax measure, on the ballot, right? Because at that point, decision makers still refused to fund parks at adequate levels. And so we decided, well, we're just going to use people power and propose something for voters, because we know now that about 72% of voters agree with us, right? Because we also implemented doing some voter surveying and getting to understand, does the broader community support the issues that we're advancing? And so I think all of that comes with time. And so I would say again that I wouldn't rush into direct advocacy without going through kind of that 9-step process of really thinking through how your coalition is going to be structured and how you're going to make decisions, and and how you're going to respond when you do get attacked and when there are those tactics that are implemented about divide and conquer. And so part of that for us is being really upfront and honest about that. And so when, for example, when we were working on the general plan work and we were advancing our shared agenda, there was a staffer at City Hall at the mayor's office that started reaching out to our individual organization partners and starting to try to create some division. And so we nipped that in the bud because we called each other immediately and said, did you get this call? Right. And so that was something that we had agreed on at the front end, that if we got any type of communication, it would be shared with the rest of the group so that we could prepare adequately. And so I think those are really steps that cannot be missed or skipped over. And though sometimes issues become very emergent and urgent, we're not going to be successful unless we take some time to really quickly lay out a framework of how we're going to operate and hold each other accountable. And it's really important to do that with community, because then community members hold your coalition accountable. And so oftentimes, I would say, like in moments of weakness, right, we get calls from community members who say, hey, like that's not what we're advancing, right? Like we said this, and really important to do that and share power with community in a way that also holds you accountable to really amplifying community voice. And so one of the values that we hold at Fresno BHC is that we're not the voice of community, we're just the microphone. So we don't speak on behalf of community, right? We only repeat what community has shared with us, and we provide a microphone to elevate and amplify their voices.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So we're going to just do a quick poll now. As I mentioned, we're trying to think about what like the next set of resources, webinars, publications that we can do, how that will be most useful. And so one thing we wanted to zero in on is some of the recommendations and ideas for advocacy strategies that we shared, because we know that many of them have a lot to unpack. And so wanted to see if any of these options are ones that would be useful to y'all in your work if we were able to provide some additional resources and deeper dives into them. So first, more of the nuts and bolts of how to conduct the budget analysis. Second, how to do that alliance building and community alignment to make sure you've got a united front. Third, some of the budget process upgrades that can be used to make sure that, you know, in the virtual meetings, you know, there's actually space for community and for advocates. And then finally, creating a formal community COVID-19 task force. So please just take a minute to respond there. Okay, great. So seems like a lot of love for all of the options, but more nuts and bolts on how to to conduct a budget analysis seems like the leading one. Thank you. That's really helpful, and hopefully we'll have some updates to share on what we'll be able to provide on all of these. Great. And then Jackie, can we turn to you to move us through the last section?
Yes, thank you. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to kind of get us home, you know, one of the last lectures we had was really talking about and identifying strategies to making equity essential during this COVID-19 era. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, you know, I think, you know, we can really look to the Great Recession, earlier what Danielle had talked about, as a way to really prepare for what we will expect to see from policymakers really in the weeks to come. Most cities are looking to pass budgets, you know, in May, June. And we do know that there may be a delayed timeline with counties and school districts revisiting their budgets later in the fall. But that said, what we can begin to see are a series of playbooks, or the playbook that policymakers usually make when they're trying to balance their budgets. The following are ones that I would say for you all, when you start looking at the budget, proposed budgets that produce, you'll see them begin to cut spending in programs and services. You'll see them looking to restructure departments. Even in some cases, they may be talking about privatizing services and or eliminating positions. And finally, you may see them draw from reserves to at least patch up their budgets in the interim. And so these are a lot of the different approaches that policymakers took during the Great Recession. But the one thing we will say is that while policymakers were needing to make cuts in order to balance their budgets, they did so while still trying to protect and or, if possible, increase spending for public safety and business supports. And when we mean by business supports, we're not talking about generally small and pop businesses. We're talking about developers or big business who have the ability to pay lobbyists to help win them certain favors from council or county. And so they were able to, again, public safety departments and businesses were able to protect their budgets or be able to see some increases in spending in their way under the claim that they were essential services. And so we actually heard Sandra talk about that earlier. And I just really want to highlight this piece because it is one where when you start to hear them talk about cuts and what needs to be protected, this essential service narrative has usually been used to protect public safety and business supports. And so again, Sandra talked about this, but really thinking about that narrative and wanting to challenge that narrative and redefine it is really critical in this time. We can go to the next slide, please. And so these are 3 case study examples where we saw the impacts of the Great Recession and what approaches those local jurisdictions took to make up their budget cuts. The first example is Fresno City, where we have Sandra who was able to talk about it. And here we saw that between 2009 and 2013, the city's parks budget was reduced by 53%. During these years, this is when the city decided to shift to a privatization and volunteer model to operate and maintain many of their parks and community centers. And so they did this to try to balance the budget. The big lesson here is that once you see those cuts, basically in future years, once there was a recovery from the Great Recession, those departments are really struggling just to get back up to the level they were before. And so if we were to look at their budget today, we would see that they're barely making it up. And that's a lot of it is due to the great organizing work happening in Fresno to make sure that happened. So it didn't just happen on its own. And then in LA City in 2009, there was a Commission for Children, Youth, and Their Families that was reorganized into another department that then was dissolved. So in essence, the commission went defunct with the dissolution of the department. Again, this is another example of how at the time during the Great Recession, policymakers felt the need to get rid of things that they didn't see as essential. This fell under that, and so they allowed it to, in essence, to dissolve. And in the final example is Merced County, where in 2009, the county began to make a series of cuts to their medical assistance program. It's a health safety net program that served over 1,400 residents. And so between 2009 and 2016, they made a series of cuts that basically left it with no remaining staff or beneficiaries. So in essence, they hollowed out this program over that time. And so these are 3 strategies. In essence, they're either the cut and shift strategy that we saw in Fresno, where they moved money away from parks to try to protect services in public safety, or in LA City, where you saw the strategy more about restructuring and then later dissolution. And then finally, there's the hollowing out. And so we say this because as you begin to hear from policymakers around what they plan to do, you should really be keen to listening to any strategies around restructuring, any strategies around moving things around. And again, you can use those budget positions as ways to start to suss out that they're actually parsing down and cutting down. And one more thing I'll just add here is that you can easily imagine a world where if these programs and services were protected, they would actually be incredibly beneficial to have around right now when people need access to resources, whether they're health access, whether it's actually having recreation programs for youth who don't have any real services around in their neighborhood. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so again, this just really lifts up the need to demand justice during this COVID-19 response. We need to do that by challenging and really going against the essential service narrative that really paved the way for disproportionate law enforcement suppression of communities of color and racialized displacement and gentrification. So if we were to look at the impacts of the Great Recession, we noticed that there was more spending for police suppression, more officers in communities, again, patrolling, impacting young people of color, and you had communities of color who had to move out of those communities and weren't around to be able to benefit from the investments that were then made in those communities to improve them. And so, it really is important that we demand justice during this recovery, unlike the previous one, and that we apply a racial equity lens in that approach so that Black, Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant communities who have been, confronting longstanding inequities aren't being left out of the recovery and aren't seeing their recovery being cut short or hindered. We can go to the next slide. So there is a series of recommendations that we have. The first is, we're saying it's a policymaker one, but again, it also applies to community, is that we're really asking policymakers to apply a racial equity lens to any COVID-19 related policy and budget shifts. So what does that mean? Earlier, Assad mentioned that there's money coming down from the federal government that's supposed to be for COVID-19 related budgets. And so here, this is important because we can say there needs to be a racial equity lens, knowing who the most impacted communities are. We already have data on that. And so any dollars that are coming down should be taking into account this population. We also saw, folks in Long Beach pass a great measure or a great, they won a great victory at the city council where the city council now is including and required the city manager to include a racial equity lens impact statement to any COVID-19 responses that the city takes. Then on advocate end, here again, redefining the narrative, so challenging that narrative, expanding it to include communities of color and more health-serving, promoting services, and also making the affirmative case for investment. So it's not just a matter of protecting what you currently have, but trying to expand that. We're also calling for and advocates to call for equitable use of federal, state, and local revenues. That's something we've talked about already, where there's Title I dollars, CDBG dollars, equity are already sort of built into those, so we want to make sure that they're actually lived into. And that we even think about packaging those one-time funds that are coming from the state and federal government with local revenues to expand services. We can go to the next slide. And then the final recommendation we have for advocates, and I think it underscores what Sandra already called for, is really being ready for the long haul. And so, this mostly applies to counties and school districts, but we know that there will be a second round of budget deliberations in late summer and early fall. And so this means that there will potentially be either some new money or they're going to be talking about cuts. So being ready in that time period will be critical. Just because they may pass a budget in June doesn't mean that things are over and you come back to the decision, but come back to them later the next year. Then that really requires folks to be sustaining budget engagement with their partners and policymakers. So constantly meeting with them and being in front of them to really lift up the needs that community has been identifying. And then the final one, which is one that a lot of folks were kind of alluding to earlier, was this Schools and Communities First initiative. It's a ballot initiative that is going to be on the ballot in November. If passed by voters, it would actually increase and bring down new revenues for local governments from school districts all the way up to counties. And so these dollars are flexible dollars that would potentially could be used for anything. And so really being keen on making sure that those dollars are set aside for health promoting and equity purposes is critical. There's other strategies that can be applied there, but I just want to make sure that folks, that's top of mind. So pass it over briefly to Sandra, because I know we're almost at time. if you don't mind just sharing some of the work that you all are doing in Fresno to really look ahead and making sure that equity is part of the conversation with the policy.
Yes. Thank you, Jackie. So part of the work that we have been doing now, as I mentioned, for the last 6 years and really longer with all of the preparation work, is that we really started to look at long-term investments in our community. So I did talk about the fact that we've identified, among other priorities, our top 2 is really around access to healthy and affordable housing, and also parks and outdoor spaces. And so part of the work that we've done is really outlining long-term strategies in order to shift investment into these areas. And so we have really identified partner organizations that serve as anchor institutions. So for example, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, Faith in Fresno, among others, who really help shepherd and lead some of the work around these issues and tying it both to regional and statewide efforts. So if you live in a community like Fresno, which tends to be led by decision makers that are more conservative and really not reflective of the community in general, we do rely on applying pressure through external channels such as the state or other programming. And so, for example, one of the things that we've been working on for the last couple of years is around the Transformative Climate Communities program, and also the AB 617, the Community Air Monitoring Program, which has made funding available at the state level for places like Fresno in order to invest in both environmental justice around cleaning our air and removing pollution, and also adding economic benefits to communities, specifically communities that are heavily impacted by environmental pollution. And so part of that work for us has really been about how do we tie that to the community priorities, specifically in Southwest Fresno, around not just removing pollution, but also creating housing and economic opportunities for residents that have traditionally been left behind or left out. And so that's work that we've really been able to go up and down across, those institutional levels. And then the other piece is also that really building up our people power so that we don't necessarily have to rely on elected officials, right? One of my favorite sayings is that politicians come and go, but community organizers stay forever. And so that, is really about the fact that it showed up for us, as I mentioned, in our Measure P work, which is about building the people power that if you're not going to listen and include us in decision making, that we're just going to take action into our own hands. And so I think it's important to be able to build both of those avenues, right? So you want to build partnerships as best as you can with decision makers, but you also want to build enough muscle that you can take action in spite of or around them as an organizing strategy. And then the other piece is also really practicing communications around the priorities that are set for your community. And so one example that we were provided earlier is just how much funding goes to our police department. Over 52% of the general fund is dedicated to our police department. And so instead of approaching it from, a sense of defunding the police, which we know is not necessarily a strategy that would work, we really want to highlight how ineffective our policing department has been at implementing community policing, right? And so there's also room to shift the narrative in how resources are being spent in a way that are not conducive or serving community. So I think it's really important to identify, again, those levers of if you're not going to be able to shift funding, can you shift the way that those departments operate in a way that will benefit community? Or if you can shift funding, then how do you leverage external partners to be able to help do that? So I would share, some of that is our ongoing work, and I'm sure you'll hear about it. So stay connected with us and, help us from, if you're not in Fresno County, you can still help advance our work by becoming one of our regional or statewide partners.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll just wrap it up now. If we can move to the next slide. So just as folks are heading out, I know we were not able to answer all the questions, but it would be really helpful if you could just in the chat box share if there was something that we lifted up that was helpful or relevant to your work, if you could share that. And also, we are always looking to improve. So if there are ideas for additional information or subjects that future webinars or other resources could address, please do share that with us, and we will review it. And again, we will be following up, so stay tuned. First, immediately, we will be sending an email around that does include the recording as well as the slide deck for folks who are interested in that. We'll also try to respond to some of the questions that we didn't get to, so keep an eye on your inbox. That is thing one. Second, we also are doing a post-event survey, so we can learn a little more about how to be most useful. That should pop up automatically when the meeting ends. So if you do have a moment, please fill that out. But we know a lot of folks are often scheduled back-to-back on Zoom calls, so there will also be a link to that survey in the email. So you can answer it then if that is most convenient. And we look forward to staying in touch. We are planning to send out some updates, potentially an updated supplement to the brief in a few weeks, because things are moving rapidly. There is a lot of additional information coming out. And I know there were a couple questions, for example, that were more focused on school districts and early childhood education. That's an issue we're exploring with our education team at Advancement Project California. So hopefully a lot more to share. Once again, thank you so much for spending your morning with us. Thank you again to Sandra for sharing your great expertise and knowledge and understanding of how to advocate in challenging environments. We really appreciate it. And again, if you want to get in touch with any of us, here are the best ways to do so, including our social media challenges. And you can also send a note to eci@advancedproj.org if you'd like to follow up on anything that you heard today. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and hope it was of value.